I'm Leandra Letterman, and today's topic is tax research. I'm really pleased to have a guest speaker today who will lead us through a discussion of the tax research process.
I'm Ashley Albrand, and I'm the Assistant Director for Public Services at the Jerome Hall Law Library at Indiana University Maurer School of Law.
Tax law research is a type of legal research. So Ashley, how do you usually recommend starting a research project?
Well, when I'm discussing legal research with my students, this path pictured here is what I typically recommend to ensure an efficient and effective legal research process. Depending on your level of expertise and familiarity with the topic that you're researching, you might vary from this path somewhat, but the steps depicted here are a helpful starting point for any legal research scenario, including tax. So I thought I'd briefly review the major steps depicted in this process, and then I thought we'd delve into the steps a little bit more to see how the process might change when you're researching tax law problems specifically. As rudimentary as it may sound, when you set out to research a legal topic, I recommend that you first start by planning your research itself. There are multiple reasons why this is important for a legal practitioner. First, time is money, so having a plan before you start researching will make the process more efficient. And in the context of online legal research using paid subscription services like Lexis and Westlaw, research is money as well. So you want to make sure that you know what searches you want to run and what sources you need to consult, rather than going in blind and just running random searches. So at this stage, then, what you want to think about are questions like, what legal issues can you identify? And are there any issues of fact that could influence the application of the law? Other things include, what is your likely jurisdiction? And considering each of those issues before you jump into research will set you on a more efficient path forward.
Those are great points. Answering legal questions typically depends on applying the law to the facts. So identifying the factual and legal issues is really important. After you've planned your research, you need to figure out where to start. Let's talk about primary and secondary sources.
Well, as you get started on research, it's often helpful to start with secondary sources, especially if you're dealing with an area of law with which you're less familiar. For those that are unfamiliar with legal research, because a lot of different disciplines talk about primary and secondary sources, in law, we divide legal research materials into two categories, again, primary and secondary sources. Primary sources in law are the law itself, such as statutes, cases, and regulations. Secondary sources really are anything else, anything that explains or analyzes the law or even critiques the law. The end game in legal research is to find what the law says, so to find those primary sources that are of relevance to your legal research question. So it can be tempting to go straight to cases or straight to statutes when you start your research. But secondary sources can be extremely helpful at the onset of your research process. If you're researching an area of law in particular that you're less familiar with, the explanation, background, and analysis that a secondary source provides, such as a legal treatise or a law journal article, can often help you set your research process off on the right path. But even if you're reasonably well versed in that particular area of law, secondary sources are still an excellent place to start because the sources they reference in text or cite in their footnotes are most often the critical statutes and cases addressing that legal issue. So starting with a secondary source can often be a strong launching off point for your research into primary sources. So primary source research is the ultimate goal here. What does the law say in answer to your legal research question? As you get into primary source research, one thing you should always ask is whether there's a statute that addresses your question. If there is a statute on point, in almost all circumstances, it must be followed, and a court will be obliged to interpret the statute's meaning and apply it to the case at hand, unless the court finds that the statute is unconstitutional. But that doesn't happen very often. That said, for the general legal research process, as a common law jurisdiction, much of US federal and state law comes from case decisions themselves. Tort law is often a good example. If you don't find a statute on point, don't panic. That could just mean that the issue that you're dealing with is a common law issue and there isn't a direct statute that applies. However, I do always like to caution my students that there's usually some kind of a statute you should find in the legal research process, such as statutes of limitations that would apply to, for instance, your tort law issue. But that does ultimately lead us to case law research. Whether your legal issue is based in statute or in common law, so even if you find a statute that directly applies to your legal research question, you will end up looking for case law to see how the courts have interpreted, applied, or criticized the law in similar cases over time. As your case law research progresses, you can use tools built into subscription databases like Lexis and Westlaw to find additional relevant authority. So remember to look at tools like the Headnotes to a case or the key numbers that you'll find right next to those headnotes, as well as the citing references that a citator provides. All of these are different approaches that you can take to find additional relevant case law.
Ashley, you mentioned using a citator. Can you explain what that is and tell us a little bit more about it?
As you compile a list of legal authorities on your topic, both statutes and cases, it's important to ensure the authority you intend to rely on is still good law. The best way to accomplish this is by using a citator, such as Shepard's on Lexis, or on Westlaw, the citator is called KeyCite. And if you're on Bloomberg Law, they have a citator as well, and it's called BCite. A citator indicates the treatment of your source. And in particular here, again, what we're looking for is, most importantly, is there any negative treatment for the authority you want to rely on, such as if a court overruled an earlier case or found a statute unconstitutional. For statutes, citators will also flag pending changes to the legislation with a yellow cautionary symbol as well.
Ashley, as you've noted on screen, it's time to stop your research when you've gotten answers to all of your questions and the same sources keep recurring. Does that mean that this diagram is more of an iterative process rather than something you just follow one time through?
That's an excellent point. While I have presented here a visual of the process as a very linear format, it's anything but. When you get into the research, it's definitely more of a cyclical or iterative process where you may need to go back a few steps and come back through. In particular, as your research progresses and you start to uncover the potentially applicable law, there may be legal issues that come up in your research that you didn't think about at the beginning. So you may have to go back to your client and gather more critical facts, which may bring you back through some of those steps again.
So far, what we've been talking about is the legal research process in general. Let's now turn to tax research specifically.
I think a question you might ask here is there a big difference in how you would approach a tax research problem? And really my answer is yes and no. The process that I've just outlined is meant to be generalizable to any area of law, but there are unique aspects of tax law that might cause you to alter your approach. I still recommend starting your research by simply thinking critically about the research problem. In particular, as you start to think about the critical facts in your research scenario, for a tax problem, you'll want to consider the potential tax implications. And so the facts and the legal issues that you think about will change slightly here. For instance, what kind of a tax entity is involved? Are you dealing with an individual or a corporation or a trust? If you're working with an individual, it might be important to know their familial status and stability, as well as their place of legal domicile and citizenship. And depending on the type of client you're working with, you may very well have special tax rules that you have to apply, such as a client who's a farmer. Taking note of these details ahead of time will make your research more efficient as it progresses. Now, another factor to consider prior to jumping into research is the ultimate purpose of the research itself. Are you researching, for example, an ongoing tax transaction or litigating a completed transaction? This is something you'll know from the outset by talking to your client, but bearing that information in mind as you plan your research will help inform what materials you want to seek out. For instance, if you're working on an ongoing or a new tax transaction for your client, you'll be looking at the current tax code, but you might also need to be aware of any pending legislation or regulations that could affect the outcome of the transaction if they're enacted prior to the transaction's completion. If you're litigating a completed transaction, on the other hand, you might need to look at an older edition of the tax code from the time the transaction took place. And perhaps your research doesn't involve a tax transaction at all. If you're researching an area of tax for academic purposes, like maybe you're writing a seminar paper, your research materials might look entirely different. You might be exploring the legislative history of a tax statute or exploring more critical analysis of a tax issue to apply to your thesis. No matter what your research question looks like, This preliminary analysis that you do before you jump into the databases will help inform how your research progresses.
So now let's turn to secondary sources in the tax context.
In terms of the stages of the research process, I think the biggest departure I often see is whether and when to consult secondary sources. Particularly if you're researching an unfamiliar area of law, I recommend starting with a secondary source to get your bearings. But tax law is an area where starting with the tax code itself may be a preferred first step for some. Tax practitioners often become so well versed in tax law that they know instinctively where in the tax code they'll be researching, in which case it can make sense to start directly with the tax code to find the applicable statutes. You might then look to secondary sources later in your research process if the need for analysis and interpretation arises. And you'll find that many secondary sources in tax law are actually organized around the structure of the tax code, so that if you know what tax statute applies, you can easily find explanation and analysis of that statute in a secondary source just by browsing the source's table of contents.
So I usually recommend to students who have a tax research question that they start with the B&A tax management portfolio on that topic, because that will help give them a really good overview of the area with a lot of detailed cites to the primary sources. So now let's talk about tax statutes.
It's always important in legal research to determine whether there's a statute that addresses your research question, but in many areas of law, there isn't. Some areas of law are dominated, as I've said, by common law, so the law itself is found in case opinions. Tax law, however, is statute-driven. The tax code is robust, so the question in tax research isn't really, does a statute apply, but what statute applies? I don't like to speak in absolutes because someone will always find an exception, but I will say that there's almost certainly a tax statute that applies to your tax research question.
And sometimes there's more than one tax statute. So part of the issue may be identifying all of the statutes that apply and figuring out how they interact. And as you're working your way through tax statutes, don't forget to watch the Break Into Tax video, How to Read a Tax Statute.
Most jurisdictions collect their main tax statutes into a particular portion of their statutory code. For example, at the federal level, the majority of our tax statutes are in Title 26 of the US Code, commonly referred to as the Internal Revenue Code, or sometimes just the tax code. But again, there are always exceptions, so your research may also take you to other legislation or other parts of the US Code that have tax implications as well. These exceptions are another good plug for using secondary sources in legal research, which might lead you to these non-tax code provisions that might not otherwise be obvious to you in your research. Your statutory research in tax can lead you to materials that help you interpret the statutes as well. For example, watch for references to Treasury regulations and other administrative guidance when you're researching tax questions to avoid missing any critical authority. My emphasis on statutory research does not mean that cases are unimportant in tax law. In fact, once you find any relevant tax statutes, the next step should be to explore cases that have interpreted and applied those statutes. Leandra, would you like to talk a bit about the federal courts that hear tax cases?
Sure. Often the taxpayer has a choice among three federal courts at the trial level. That's the U.S. District Court in the taxpayer's jurisdiction, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, and the U.S. Tax Court. Also, U.S. bankruptcy courts can consider tax matters that arise in bankruptcy. And each of these courts has a particular appeal path and precedent that applies, and those issues are covered in more detail in the Break Into Tax video, an overview of U.S. federal tax controversies.
One final thing I'll note about the U.S. Tax Court is that, like other courts, it publishes both precedential and non-precedential opinions. Regular decisions are published in the Tax Court Reporter and are sometimes called division opinions. These are precedential. If you come across a tax court memorandum opinion, these are technically non-precedential, typically involving cases where the decision is particularly fact-based and where the law itself is already settled by earlier precedent. So the final thing I would stress about tax law research is that it doesn't often end with finding all the relevant statutes, cases, or regulations. The IRS produces a large volume of interpretive materials that can help researchers understand and apply tax law. These materials are given varying degrees of deference by the courts, but all can be beneficial in the tax research process. I won't discuss them all here. The subject of the weight of authority in tax research can be reserved for another video, but suffice it to say that interpretive tax materials abound. And when litigating or simply researching a tax question, looking to documents such as these, where the IRS explains its own processes and offers its own interpretations, can be of critical importance to the researcher.
How about a quick review of the major steps in the tax research process?
Sure. No matter what path you take, your process should lead you through these 5 steps in some varying order. First, you want to get to know your tax research scenario. Glean the pertinent facts and make a plan of what materials you need to consult. Second, determine the governing tax law, whatever it might be. This might entail starting with a secondary source, which is always, again, what I would recommend, or it might mean diving directly into the tax code to find the relevant statutes, depending on your comfort level. Next, it's critical to know how to apply the law that you find. This is another area where secondary sources can come in handy, but it's also where you'll want to dive into case law to see how the courts have interpreted your tax statutes. You might also look at Treasury regulations and IRS publications, such as revenue rulings, to see how the agency interprets the tax statute as well. Once you're confident that you've found the laws that apply to your research question, it's important to ensure that there's still good law. In legal research, this typically entails using a citator, which will indicate any negative treatment for the statute or case. And then the big question we often get in legal research is when to stop researching, because it's often not very obvious. If you have answered all of your research questions and each iterative search that you've run is bringing back the same results, these are good indications that you've found all relevant authority and are ready to present your findings.
This has been the tax research process.
Thank you for joining us as you break into tax.
Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the Break Into Tax YouTube channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos.